All right, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We're glad that you're with us. We are studying through Genesis, and this is chapter 18 and 19. And we're glad that you're here. If you want to open up your Bible, and we'll begin there in just a moment and make some comments, some observations. There are a whole lot of things that we could notice in these chapters, and so we're going to do our best to do it in about a 45-minute period, and hope that you'll follow along, that you'll take notes, and it'll be a beneficial lesson to you. Let's start off like we always do. Let's do our review. Genesis is the book of beginnings and book of generations. Genesis follows four great events in the first 11 chapters. The very first one is creation, then the fall, then the flood, and then the Tower of Babel, Genesis 10 and 11. Very good. And once you get to Genesis chapter 12, we begin following our first of heroes of faith, as they're called. First one is Abram, or Abraham. The second one is his son, who we haven't met yet, and his name is Isaac. The third great hero of faith that Genesis follows is Jacob, and the last one is Joseph. Very good. There are two key verses we've assigned for the book of Genesis. The very first one occurs in the first 11 chapters, actually in chapter 3 and verse 15, and it is the seed promise. The seed promise, Genesis 3 and verse 15. I kind of gave you that one on my own. You're supposed to say Genesis 3:15 is one of the key verses. The other key verse is in the last 40 some odd chapters, and that is the promise of Genesis 12, 1 through 3. Genesis 12, 1 through 3. And that's the promise God makes to Abraham, or Abram at that time, that of his seed all nations of the earth shall be blessed. There are four different parts to that promise. The very first one is that Abram is going to have a people. A people. The second one is God's going to give them a place. A place. Number three, third part of the promise, God is going to provide his protection, or his presence. And the fourth one is the plan that God is going to redeem mankind, and God is going to bless all nations of the earth through Abram's seed. When you get to Genesis chapter 18 and 19, I want to study these just a little bit differently, because there's a way that we can look at them that really shows the contrast between Abram, the friend of God, and Lot, the friend of the world. And you look at Genesis 18 and 19 and notice some things about where God is and what God is doing in both of these situations and in both of these chapters. And so that's the approach that we're going to take, is contrasting, comparing Genesis 18 and 19, but also looking at generally where God is in both of these chapters. I'd like to, if we can, just read through Genesis chapter 18, and we'll come back and make some observations. Then we'll look at Genesis 19 and make some observations as well. So if you've got your Bible with you, you want to go and follow along. I'm just going to put up the screen here so that you can see. And the things that stand out to you, I want you to mark them in your Bible, or make a note of them, put maybe a question mark next to the things that are kind of interesting to you, or confusing, or things that you just notice about the text. That's a mark of a good Bible student and a good investigator of the biblical text, is when you see some things that stand out to you and you want them to make more sense. Genesis 18 verse 1, Then the Lord, that's the proper name of God, Yahweh, appeared to him, that's Abram, or Abraham now, by the terebinth tree of Mamre, as he was sitting in the tent of the door in the heat of the day. So he lifted his eyes and looked, and behold, 3 men were standing by him. When he saw them, he ran from his tent door to meet them, and bowed himself to the ground, and said, My Lord, if now I found favor in your sight, do not pass on by your servant. Please let a little water be brought, and wash your feet, and rest yourselves under the tree, and I will bring a morsel of bread, that you may refresh your hearts. After that you may pass by, inasmuch as you have come to your servant. And they said, Do as you've said. So Abraham hurried into the tent to Sarah and said, Quickly, make ready 3 measures of fine meal, knead it, and make cakes. And Abraham ran to the herd, took a tender and good calf, and gave it to a young man, and he hastened to prepare it. And so he took the butter and the milk which the calf had prepared, and the calf which he had prepared, and set it before them, and stood by under the tree as they ate. And they said to him, Where is Sarah, your wife? And he said, Here in the tent. And he said, I will certainly return to you according to the time of life, and behold, Sarah, your wife, shall have a son. Sarah was listening at the tent door which was behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, well advanced in age, and Sarah had passed the age of childbearing. Therefore Sarah laughed within herself, saying, After I've grown old, shall I have pleasure, my Lord also being old also? And the Lord said to Abraham, Why did Sarah laugh, saying, Surely I shall bear a child, since I am old? Is anything too hard for the Lord? At the appointed time I will return to you according to the time of life, and Sarah shall have a son. But Sarah denied it, saying, I did not laugh, for she was afraid. And he said, No, but you did laugh. And the Lord said, Shall I hide? Then the men rose from there and looked toward Sodom, and Abraham went with them to send them on their way. And the Lord said, Shall I hide from Abraham what I'm doing? Since Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation. All right. God making this reiteration here. And the nations of all the earth shall be blessed in him. For I have known him, and in order that he may command his children, his household after him, that they keep the way of the Lord to do righteousness and justice, that the Lord may bring to Abraham what he's spoken to him. And the Lord said, Because the outcry of Sodom and Gomorrah is great, and because their sin is very grave, I will go down now and see whether they have done altogether according to the outcry against it that has come to me, and if not, I will know. Then the men turned away from there and went toward Sodom, but Abraham still stood before Yahweh, the Lord. And Abraham came near, said, Would you also destroy the righteous with the wicked? Suppose there were 50 righteous within the city. Would you also destroy the place and not spare it for 50 righteous that were in it? Far be it from you to do such a thing as this, to slay the righteous with the wicked, so that the righteous should be as the wicked. Far be it from you. Shall not the judge of all the earth do what's right? So the Lord said, If I find in Sodom 50 righteous within the city, then I will spare all the place for their sakes. And Abraham answered and said, Indeed, now I, who am but dust and ash, have taken it upon myself to speak to the Lord. Suppose there were 5 less than the 50 righteous. Would you destroy all the city for lack of 5? And he said, If I find 45, I will not destroy it. And he spoke to him yet again and said, Suppose there should be 40 found there. He said, I will not do it for the sake of 40. Then he said, Let not the Lord be angry, and I will speak. Suppose 30 shall be found there. And he said, I will not do it if I find 30 there. And he said, Indeed, now I have taken it upon myself to speak to the Lord. Suppose 20 should be found there. And he said, I will not destroy it for the sake of 20. Then he said, Let not the Lord be angry, and I will speak but once more. Suppose 10 should be found there. And he said, I will not destroy it for the sake of 10. And so the Lord went his way as soon as he finished speaking with Abraham, and Abraham returned to his place. There are a number of interesting things, as I mentioned, about this text and about Genesis 18 and 19 as a whole. But let's notice just a couple of things together as we study. The first thing is, where is the Lord? And what is happening here in this situation regarding the Lord? Generally, chapter 18, verse 1, Then the Lord appeared to him by the terebinth tree of Mamre. This is a device that's known as, a lot of scholars believe this is what this is anthropomorphism. Anthropomorphism. Those of you that may be having flashbacks to your English classes from high school, that's exactly what this is. It's attributing human characteristics, human attributes to non-humans, okay, to things that are not human. It would be an English anthropomorphism to say the sun cried, or the clouds cried, right? The sun beamed, or the sun smiled. You're attributing things that are particularly human to things that are not human. These visitors to Abraham are decidedly not human. That is, not flesh and blood. They are in the form, they're in the appearance, they're referred to as man, but they're not humans proper, I guess is a good way to say that. Note that they appear, verse 2, in 3 men standing by him. And as he goes on in the text, verse 9, when they begin to speak, they begin to ask the question, and they said to him, verse 9, they said to him, Where is Sarai your wife, or Sarah your wife? And verse 10, now you just have an individual speaking. And note that here in the New King James, they have it capitalized that he spoke, or he said. I will certainly refer or come back at this time to the time of life. Behold, Sarah will have a son. You jump down to verse 13, and we're following just the pronouns here of the people that are speaking. And it says, And the Lord said to Abraham, Why did Sarah laugh, saying, Surely I shall bear a child? God himself, Jehovah, is speaking here on this occasion. You go down to verse 15, and he said, No, but you did laugh. And then as the men get up and begin to walk away from here, the men rose from there, looked toward Sodom. Abraham went to send them on their way. The Lord, verse 17, is still there standing with Abraham, and he's still speaking. But verse 22 says, Then the men turned away from there and went toward Sodom, but Abraham still stood before the Lord. So what you have here is, in these three individuals, you have one who is God, who is Jehovah, who anthropomorphically appears before Abraham in this form of a man. But then you have two others that we're going to learn in chapter 19 are angels, are ones who are sent by God, who are the purpose of destruction and bringing about a judgment upon Sodom and Gomorrah. But these are the ones that are here standing with God and standing with Abraham. As we look at Abraham and at his life and appearing before these heavenly beings, these divine messengers, we can notice a couple of things that are interesting to us. And once again, when we get to chapter 19, we'll contrast these with Lot and his plight and life circumstance. As you notice the first 5 verses here in Genesis 18, notice that Abraham recognized who they were. And he also ministered to the Lord, verses 1 through 5. Look at the action words that are attributed to Abraham. Abraham lifted his eyes and looked. He saw them. He took the occasion and saw that there's a relationship here, and there's something special about these three men. He saw them, and what did he do? He didn't take the occasion to say, oh, that's nice. I think I'll let these guys pass on by their way. You kind of look sometimes and see people and think, oh, that's interesting, but you don't necessarily want to get involved, and you don't want to try and make contact if you can at all help it. He ran from the tent door to meet him, and also there is a humility. Abraham being great already and having a great amount of possessions, we learned that back at Genesis 14, where he just took 318 of his servants and ran to chase after his nephew Lot. But here Abraham, being great himself, took the time to bow before these men. But also what you find is Abraham in his action words, Abraham is speaking very respectfully. My Lord, if I've now found favor in your sight. This is the lesser appealing to the greater, bowing down himself, speaking respectfully, and then ministering to these visitors, to these messengers. He says, please let a little bit of water be brought and wash your feet and rest yourselves under the tree. I'll bring a morsel of bread that you may refresh your hearts. After that you may pass by. And as much as you have come to, and Abraham says, he calls himself your servant. They give him permission. And Abraham then goes on and runs to his wife and says, honey, we've got unexpected visitors. We need to take good care of them. Abraham not only ministered to the Lord, but he also ministered, if you can say this, to his wife in the next 15 verses. Abraham wasn't content just to let Sarah do it all herself. I know wives appreciate that aspect in their husbands, that when there's visitors or when there's company coming over, let's clean the house, let's put the good silver out, or whatever the case may be. We want to do this together, and it's not just the wife tidying up the house or preparing the meal or anything else like that, but Abraham ministered to his wife. He helped. Sarah, I keep calling her Sarai because that was her other name. Sarah is 89 years old at this time. 89 years old. And Abraham was still a source of blessing to his home by faithfully serving God. And he ministered to his wife and taking good care of her and making sure that she had what she needed here in this situation. I think that's a remarkable point about this great hero of faith, that he wasn't just content to let his wife do it all. And that's a great lesson that we can drop off as we're flying over. When we jump down in the context, Sarah is laughing here about the promise of God. And Sarah is laughing because she's saying, shall I surely bear a child, verse 13, since I am old? And we look at Sarah and we look at her laughter, but we also look back a chapter or two and we find that Abraham also, when he heard the promise of God, laughed as well. I think Genesis chapter 17 was the one where he laughed about that. I should have looked this up beforehand. Ah, yes, Genesis 17 and verse 17. Genesis 17:17. Abraham fell on his face, and he laughed, and said in his heart, shall a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? Shall Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child? And Abraham said to God, oh, that Ishmael might live before you. Sorry, it said Sarah was 89. She's actually 90 at this time, but it doesn't change the fact that she's old, advanced in years. And as God talks to her, as God talks to Abraham, Genesis 17, he says, you're going to have a child. It's going to be yours and Sarah's. Abraham laughs. Here in Genesis 18, Sarah is standing there listening at the door of the tent to this conversation between Abraham and these messengers, between Abraham and God, and she laughs in her heart. But the Lord knows. And the Lord, as we've mentioned before, has the last laugh. As they bear a child in their old age, and they name his name Isaac, which in Hebrew simply means laughter. It's God causing these people to laugh in their old age, but God bringing about the promise that he had made all the way back from Genesis chapter 12, some 25 years earlier, and God bringing that about because nothing is too hard from the Lord, as he says here in this context. Look at the ministry of Abraham, not only to the Lord, not only to his wife, but also to this lost world. Beginning in Genesis 16, as these men rise and go towards Sodom, Abraham standing there, sending them on their way, God seemingly has this conversation, with God, with himself, with what we would call the Godhead or the Trinity. And he's talking by divine inspiration. Moses records this conversation that God has and says, what am I going to do? Am I going to leave my plans, just up for interpretation? Am I going to leave Abraham blind about what it is that I'm going to do to Sodom and Gomorrah? He says, no, what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell Abraham exactly what's going on. So verse 20, here's the Lord speaking again to Abraham. Because the outcry of Sodom and Gomorrah is great, and because their sin is very grave, I'm going to go down now and see if they've all done altogether according to the outcry against it that's come to me, and if not, I will know. God is wanting to get a first-hand account of what's going on down in Sodom and Gomorrah. I don't know how the ground or how the outcry was against God, or we know that from the book of Job that his messengers walk to and fro about the earth, and they bring back, as it were, reports to God, and it seems like something like that is here and taking place, but we just don't know. It could be like Cain. Remember that when Cain visited with the Lord back in Genesis chapter 4, God said, the blood of your brother Abel is crying out to me from the ground. We know Revelation chapter 6, the saints whose blood was spilled, the martyrs, were crying out under the altar, saying, how long, O Lord, until you avenge us? Revelation 6 and verse 10. There was an outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah because of their wickedness, and God is now going to inspect and find out if that outcry is there, and if it is, he's going to destroy them. Abraham understands that, and Abraham, in this situation, begins to make intercession. Word intercession just simply is making an intervention on behalf of another. Abraham knows the Lord personally. He was obedient to his will, and therefore he knew about Sodom and its future more than really any of its residents. It doesn't seem like Sodom was really concerned about their outcry and about their disobedience. His prayer wasn't based on the mercy of God, but simply upon the justice of God. What is God going to do? Look at verse 25. This is an interesting verse. Abraham speaking to God, saying, far be it from you to do such a thing as this, to slay the righteous with the wicked, so that the righteous should be as the wicked. Far be it from you. Shall not the judge of all the earth do what's right? It's not Abraham saying these people don't deserve to be punished, but he's saying there's people that are righteous in Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, God, are you going to deal with Sodom and Gomorrah and really wipe out the righteous with the wicked, the people that are walking according to your law? And are you really going to do that, to wipe these people out with the wicked. And God, Abraham appealing to God, he makes this appeal based upon God's justice, that God's not going to destroy the righteous with the wicked. Yes, the wicked are going to fall under the judgment of God, but not the righteous. God wouldn't destroy somebody that's walking according to his word and walking according to his will here in the patriarchal age. And a just and holy God is not going to destroy the righteous with the wicked. You can write out beside verse 25, 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 6 through 9. 2 Peter 2, verses 6 through 9, to talk about righteous Lot. And these cities had already had a testimony in the book of Genesis as being exceedingly wicked cities. Flip back just a couple of pages to Genesis 13 and verse 13. Genesis 13 and verse 13. Here's Lot after Abraham, or Abram at this time, and Lot looking at it in all of their cattle and all of their herds and all of their herdsmen and not getting along. And Abraham says, "Which way are you going, Lot? I'll give you first pick." And Lot, verse 12, pitched his tent towards Sodom. But note that the Bible is not unclear about the reputation of Sodom. The men of Sodom were exceedingly wicked and sinful against the Lord. That's danger, Will Robinson. That's something that Lot really should have taken into account, as we'll see here in just a moment in Genesis 19. Abraham barters. Abraham visits with the Lord and whittles down this this beginning number of 50. And he whittles over the course of about 10 verses here down to just simply 10. Just simply 10. Verse 32, "Let not the Lord be angry, I'll speak once more. Suppose 10 should be found there. I will not destroy it for the sake of 10. I wonder if Abraham stopped too early. It's an interesting question. Would God destroy the righteous with the wicked for 50? And God says, no, I'm not going to destroy I'll spare the cities for 50 righteous if there's 50 righteous found in there. Okay, what about 45? What about 40? What about 30? What about 20? What about 10? What if Abraham had kept going? Will God destroy the city for 5 righteous? Will God destroy the cities if there was just 2 righteous? Would God destroy the cities if there was just 1 righteous person in these cities? The fact that Abraham was righteous and he was a friend of God has already been testified in the book of Genesis. I wonder if he could have already gotten God down to, if we can call it that, if he could have bartered or visited with God and talked him down to just 1 righteous person. Does 1 righteous person make a difference? The answer is yes. Does God care about the soul of the righteous with the wicked? And the answer is yes. But the fact is, God is not going to destroy the righteous with the wicked. And the fact that he has to drag Lot kicking and screaming out of Sodom is something that we seriously need to take into account. Abraham was making intercession because he cared for his family. And you think about him taking care of Lot all the way through his life. From the time in Genesis 14 that he had to go after Lot and go try and save Lot from Sodom and Gomorrah, from Chedorlaomer and the kings of the north, until the time when he's now talking specifically in an intercessory capacity for sparing his family, for taking care of his family. It's testimony to the type of person Abraham was. There's Abraham, the friend of God, Genesis 18. Let's look just for a moment at Genesis 19, at Lot, the friend of the world. We're going to go ahead and read Genesis 19 because I think it's good for us to have the entire context and the entire chapter in our minds. And there's a lot of things that we can come back and take a look at, and we'll do that here in just a moment. Genesis 19. Now the 2 angels came to Sodom in the evening. God is not with them. It's just the 2 messengers, if you will. The anthropomorphic depiction of these 2 men. They came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gates of Sodom. When Lot saw them, he rose to meet them. He bowed himself with his face towards the ground. He said, "Hear now, my lords, please turn into your servant's house and spend the night, and wash your feet, that you may rise early and go on your way." They said, "No, but we'll spend the night in the open square." But he insisted strongly, and so they turned into him and entered his house. He made them a feast and baked them unleavened bread, and they ate. Now before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both old and young, all the people from every quarter surrounded the house. And they called to Lot, saying to him, Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out, that we may know them. And King James, or New King James, inserts the word carnally. And Lot went out to them to the doorway, and shut the door behind him, and said, Please, my brethren, don't do so wickedly. See, now I have 2 daughters who have not known a man. Please let me bring them out to you, and you may do to them as you wish. Only do nothing to them, these men, since the reason is that they've come under the shadow of my roof. And they said, Stand back. And then they said, This one came in here to stay, and he keeps acting like a judge. Now we will deal worse with you than with them. And so they pressed hard against the man Lot, and came near to break down the door. But the men reached out their hands, and pulled Lot into the house with them, and shut the door. And then they struck the men who were at the doorway of the house with blindness, both small and great, so they became weary trying to find the door. The men said to Lot, Have you anyone else here, sons-in-law, your sons, your daughters, and whomever you have in the city? Take them out of this place. For we will destroy this place, because the outcry against them has grown so great before the face of the Lord, and the Lord has sent us to destroy it. So Lot went out and spoke to his sons-in-law, who had married his daughters, and said, Get up, get out of this place, for the Lord will destroy the city. But his sons-in-law seemed to be joking. When the morning dawned, the angels urged Lot to say to him, Arise, take your wife and your 2 daughters who are here, and lest you be consumed in the punishment of the city. And while he lingered, the men took hold of his hand, his wife's hand, and the hands of his 2 daughters, and the Lord being merciful to him. And they brought him out and set him outside the city. So it came to pass, when they brought them outside, that he said, Escape for your life. Don't look behind you or stay anywhere in the plain. Escape to the mountains, lest you be destroyed. And Lot said, Please, no, my lords. Indeed, now your servant has found favor in your sight, and you've increased your mercy with which you have shown me by saving my life. But I cannot escape to the mountains, lest some evil overtake me and I die. See now, the city is near enough to flee to, and it's a little one. Perhaps let me escape there. Is it not a little one? And my soul shall live. And they said to him, See, I've favored you concerning this thing also, and that I will not overthrow the city for which you have spoken. Hurry, escape there, for I cannot do anything until you arrive there. Therefore the name of the city was called Zoar. And the sun had risen upon the earth when Lot entered Zoar. Then the Lord rained fire and brimstone upon Sodom and Gomorrah from the Lord out of the heavens. And he overthrew those cities, all the plain, all the inhabitants of the cities, and what grew on the ground. But his wife looked back behind him, and she became a pillar of salt. And Abraham went early in the morning to the place where he had stood before the Lord. And he looked towards Sodom and Gomorrah, and looked towards all the land of the plain. And he saw, behold, the smoke of the land which went up like the smoke of a furnace. And it came to pass, when God destroyed the cities of the plain, that God remembered Abraham, and sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow, which he overthrew the cities which Lot had dwelt. Lot went up out of Zoar, and dwelt in the mountains, and his 2 daughters were with him, for he was afraid to dwell in Zoar. And he and his 2 daughters dwelt in a cave. Now the firstborn said to the younger, Our father is old. There is no man on the earth to come into us, as is the custom of all the earth. Come, let's make our father drink wine, and we will lie with him, that we may preserve the lineage of our father. So they made their father drink wine that night. And the firstborn went in to lay with her father, and he did not know it when she lay down or when she arose. And it happened on the next day, the firstborn said to the younger, Indeed, I lay with my father last night. Let's make him drink wine tonight also, and you go in and lie with him, that we may preserve the lineage of our father. And then they made their father drink wine that night also, and the younger arose and lay with him, and they did not know that she lay down or when she arose. Then both the daughters of Lot were with child by their father. The firstborn bore a son, and his name was called Moab, for he is the father of the Moabites to this day. The younger also bore a son, and she called his name Ben-Ami. He is the father of the people of Ammon unto this day. There is a lot in this chapter, and a lot to pay attention to. As mentioned at the very beginning, we're going to do something just a little bit different, and contrasting and comparing Genesis 18 and Genesis 19. First thing we want to look at in Genesis 19 is the locations of where Abraham was versus where Lot was. Abraham was sitting at the door of his tent in Genesis 18 and verse 1. Lot is sitting in the gates of the city. That then indicates a couple of things to us. The first thing is that you find men of renown and men of judgment and men of some reputation who sit in the gates of the city. There is when people had justice and when they had disputes and when they had difficulties that arose between people, maybe disputes over property, they would go to the gates of the city in order to settle those things there. And Lot sitting here with these men means that he had spent some time with them. He had settled down here in the city of Sodom, and he was sitting in the gates of the city that was known for its remarkably and exceedingly wicked people. When you go over to the New Testament and you see passages from, well, we mentioned 2 Peter chapter 2 just a moment ago, and the book of Jude, and how righteous Lot had his soul vexed from day to day. I wonder if some disputes and matters of justice and things that came along that Lot had to kind of hold his nose and listen to, and then watch these men decide things, and realizing that Lot knew this is not right, that this is not the way that God wants us to conduct ourselves, about how day after day he endured those things. When you find in contrast Abraham, who is a friend of God and sitting in the gates of his house, and having an altar nearby, and having his worship never far from where he is, about how different that is than this person who really made his home in the world. There's a difference of time, verse 1, of when the messengers came to Abraham, but then when they arrived at Sodom. It was early afternoon when the Lord visited Abraham, Genesis 18 and verse 1. It's now evening when the angels entered Sodom. And you look and see, it seems like they knew what happened in the night. They knew how the darkness affected people. I think that's why, among other reasons, the book of Ephesians would tell us, have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness, but rather expose them. And how in different passages like 1 Thessalonians 5, it calls us children of light, walk as children of light, put on the armor of light, because the Lord knows what happens when people think that their deeds are hidden, when they're covered. But these angels enter Sodom in the evening. These visitors, Abraham had his tent and his altar, and the Lord with the two angels visited him in his tent, and they let him minister to them, and he let them they let him come into them, and come to them and take care of their needs. Lot had a home where the Lord wouldn't simply feel at home. Sometimes in different cities, it was the custom that visitors could lie down in the open square in the city. You think about that, and think about how they couldn't necessarily go to the Motel 6, or if you did, it would generally be a brothel, and it would not be perhaps a safe place to go. But in the evening, somebody that would lie down in the city center would say, I can lie down here in safety. I can make sure that things are going. Lot knows something about the city and about the people that dwell in it, and he strongly, verse 3, insisted that they come and stay with him. Please come and stay, and then you wash your feet and rise early and go on your way. Abraham said, I'm going to wash your feet. Abraham, come and stay with me, and if you want to stay, you can stay. If you want to go, you can go. But they said, no, we're going to spend the night in the open square here to Lot. But he insisted strongly, and so they come into his house. Lot had a home where the Lord wouldn't necessarily feel at home. There are different elements of hospitality that you see in Genesis 18. Abraham, we mentioned, called himself a servant. Abraham ministered to the needs of the Lord and didn't hasten to obey those things. Lot here says, come and stay in your servant's house. But it doesn't seem like he hastened to prepare a meal for them. The highlight of the evening in Sodom and Gomorrah, or Sodom, was that these immoral men had come to demand sex from these two people, from these two angelic visitors. And Lot making the statement that, I don't want you to do these to these people, but here's what I want, or here's what I have. I'll be glad to let you have my two daughters who haven't known a man. The Hebrew euphemism, they wanted to know them. I mentioned that the New King James provides the word carnally because that's what it indicates. There's a carnal relationship in knowing a person. Lot says, here's these two daughters. They're virgins. You can have them, but please don't do this to these visitors. That's quite the evening. But Lot was willing to sacrifice his two unmarried daughters. But you find these angelic visitors intervening. Contrast the messages. Abraham had God speak to him and say, your wife is going to have a child. You both are going to be parents. It's a joyful message. Even though Sarah laughed, she didn't necessarily believe, or she thought that it was crazy to think about. But Abraham getting this message of joy contrasted with verses 2 through 13 of what God is going to do here. Verses 12 and 13, God is about to destroy the home where Lot and his family are living. There is a frightening message contrasted with, for the godly man Abraham, who is right where he needs to be, a message of joy. There's a message of influence. Genesis 18 concludes with Abraham, the righteous man, visiting with the God of heaven and earth, the self-existent one, and making intercession on behalf of his family. Here's Lot with this terrifying message, now verse 14, going to his sons-in-law who married his daughters and saying, we've got to get out of here. You've got to get up and go, for the Lord is going to destroy the city. And his sons-in-law simply laugh at him and appear to him and think that he's just joking. His family is laughing when they're confronted with a message of judgment from God. There's a matter of influence. There's a matter of attitude. There's a matter of attitude. Abraham, always humble, always submissive, always wanting to please the Lord. And the first time that he has to go and get Lot, he grabs him as a prisoner of war, and Lot goes right back to Sodom back in chapter 14. Now, here is God, verse 16, or here's the messengers of God watching Lot linger in this city. As they're warning him of this destruction, Lot, verse 16, is lingering. So much so that these messengers had to take his hand, his wife's hands, the hands of his two daughters, and drag him out of the city. Now, Lot argued with them. Lot begged them to be allowed to go his own way. And through that, you find an attitude that is wholly different than what we saw back in Genesis 18 with Abraham. But lastly, you find the consequences of this. After the Lord rains down fire and brimstone, beginning verse 27, Abraham is now going back. He's standing in the exact same place where he was earlier when he began to make intercession for Sodom. Or for his family, I guess, living in Sodom. He goes back early in the morning to the place where he had stood before the Lord. He looked toward Sodom and Gomorrah and all the city of plain, and he saw and behold the smoke of the land, which went up like the smoke of a great furnace. Abraham is looking toward Sodom and Gomorrah, and he's looking with the eyes of a person who knew that that was coming. He didn't have any misconceptions, but he knew that it was going to be just a matter of time before God was going to destroy them. Look just 2 verses earlier and see the difference of Lot's wife looking back. Is there a difference in looks? It's a simple question, and the answer is obviously yes. There are some times when I'm visiting with my children about behavior and about what I expect, and if the child is not there ready to obey immediately, you know, the looks that moms and dads can give to their children and understand that that's the case. But we also understand different looks, like a look of longing. You know, we've had that look and seen that look many times over the last 2 months, and longing to be together. And there's, with the eyes, the way that a person can show their affections. Imagine the look of the wife back in verse 26, the one that was turning her into a pillar of salt. But also the look of Abraham in compassion and in regret and in sorrow, because he had so ordered his life that he was a man who was a friend of God. And can you imagine how sad it made God to have to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah? But also how sad it made Abraham to realize that his nephew now didn't have a home anymore. And the consequences of that. Now there's new hope for Abraham and excitement for Abraham and Sarah as they wait for this new son. But Lot had simply lost everything, including the sick and twisted way that this chapter concludes, verses 30 through the end of the chapter 38. Lot lost his family integrity. His daughters, in their sick plan to get dad drunk and then sleep with him, is a result of where they lived. How else can we say that? It's simply a result of how they lived. And so we ask the question, was Lot affected by the city? Going back to verse 8, Lot offering his two daughters who hadn't known a man, these same two daughters that were ready to go and sleep with dad and get him drunk in order to have children by him. Was Lot affected by the city and saying, oh, here's a viable option, as opposed to you coming in and having a homosexual relationship with these two visitors who have come into my house? Here's my two daughters. He was affected by Sodom. You jump down to verse 14. Lot obviously had other daughters. As he goes and speaks to his sons-in-law who had married his daughters. Don't know how many he had. We kind of imagine that Abraham, and vying for 10 righteous people, might have had in his mind, hey, if I can get down to 10 and Lot can rally his family together, God's going to spare the city. As Lot appeals to these sons-in-law who had married his daughters, they seem to be joking. Lot seemed to be joking to them. Were they affected by the city? When you go back to what we just talked about in verse 26, God saying, don't you dare look back. Don't you dare look back at those cities. His wife turning around. Why did she do that? What was that look? What do you suppose that look looked like there in chapter 19, verse 26? Was she affected by Sodom? His daughters, when they concocted this sick plan, verses 30 through 38, to have children by their father, were they affected by Sodom? And you look at how Lot lost everything, including his family integrity. One of the lessons we can get from this is that Lot becomes a warning to all of us who believe, who God would call righteous through the blood of Jesus Christ, but are too in love with this world. Doesn't James write to Christians in James chapter 4 and verse 4 and saying, adulterers and adulteresses, friendship with the world is enmity with God. James 1 verse 27, pure and undefiled religion is this, to take care of the widows and orphans in their distress, and to keep oneself unspotted from the world. What's the implication, James? That we can be spotted by the world. We can be affected by what we see going on around us. And we look at passages like how Lot vexed his righteous soul from day to day by enduring living in a place like Sodom in 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 6 through 10. Lot becomes a warning to all who believe but are simply in love with the world. We've got to remember, we should identify more with Abraham in Genesis 18, as we mentioned before, what Peter calls pilgrims and sojourners and travelers. We're people that live in our tents and worship here because we can't make our home too much here in this world. Versus feeling at home with the wicked and with the godless, and having to endure things that vex our righteous souls and that challenge our beliefs at every single turn, and that cause us to say, well, what they're doing may be bad, but it's not as bad as this. It's not as bad as, having an immoral relationship with these messengers from God, but here have an immoral relationship with our daughters. I wonder how many times, as parents, we sometimes sacrifice our children for the values of this world. That's probably a good lesson that we need to think about and think deeply about how we try and compromise, and about how we sacrifice integrity and family values, what ought to be present, so much so for the sake of what's going on here in the world. I think another lesson we can learn is this, that righteousness is going to preserve the wicked. Righteousness is going to preserve the wicked. God was willing to listen to Abraham. God was willing to accept Abraham's bargaining As God talks to Abraham, as Abraham talks to God, and Abraham whittles down from 50 all the way to 10, about how God was willing to listen to those things, and how about God was willing to listen to his righteous servant. We make mention of the power of prayer in our lives and about the power of making intercession on behalf of others. And Paul would tell Timothy, in talking about the behavior of godly, righteous people who are in this world but not at home in this world, and talking about 1 Timothy chapter 2 verses 1 and following, about how we make intercession and we lift up prayers for the kings and for all who are in authority and for the people who are in positions of power. There is benefit and blessing to us being righteous people and making intercession on behalf of the righteous and saying, God hears this wickedness before you, but remember your righteous servants. Righteousness preserves the wicked. I think another lesson we can learn is that wickedness is going to erode righteous judgment. Wickedness is going to erode righteous judgment. Go back and read through Lot's life and read through his decisions, especially here in Genesis chapter 19. And thinking about what Lot proposes and the way Lot behaves and the way Lot thinks and the way Lot clings to what had become so valuable to him about this place, you find that a man who is, as the New Testament would call, had a righteous soul, how he allowed the worldliness around him to erode his righteous judgment. Another lesson we can learn is, in a lot of cases, righteousness is a joke to the wicked. Those sons-in-law that Lot had, and the judgment of God, the message that he had, and as he's pleading with his sons-in-law, and most likely his daughters too, and saying, we've got to get out of the city, we've got to get out of here, and how they simply laughed at him. They simply thought he was just, pulling a prank on them. There are some things that we ought not joke about, and there are some things that we ought not be cavalier about, but especially when you talk about visiting with our friends and our family members that don't understand the lifestyle that we've chosen. They don't understand why Jesus means so much to us, and why we talk about things like the judgment of God, and they look at those things and they say, what in the world? Acts 17. Those men of Athens, as they heard Paul's sermon and they heard about the resurrection of the dead and how God was going to judge the world, they were scoffing at him. They were laughing at him because they thought, what in the world? This man has lost his mind. And righteousness a lot of times becomes a joke to the wicked. Doesn't mean we need to stop being righteous, but it means we need to make our appeal more fervent, and it means we need to continually recognize that God is going to bring this world into judgment. The earth and all that's in it shall pass away with a fervent heat, with a great noise. And as this world is rolled up as a garment and cast aside, the Lord is going to take care of the laughing. And as God did with Abraham and Sarah, God is going to have, as were, the last laugh. And we think about righteousness being joked to the wicked, but righteousness may long be affected by wickedness. Righteousness may be long affected by wickedness. The very last section of this chapter, in chapter 19, verses 30 through 38, Lot, having that righteous soul, his family was affected by that, as we mentioned a little while ago. And we want to have a legacy in our lives of being people that wholly follow the Lord, including emphasizing the things that are important to God and that God wants us to do in the way that he wants us to behave. It means emphasizing the things that accord with godliness and fleeing from wickedness when we have the opportunity. Several different occasions in the New Testament. 1 Timothy chapter 6. Paul has to tell Timothy, you flee from immorality. Paul would tell that to the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, and saying that we need to stay away from fornication. We need to stay away from some things. And we abhor that which is evil. We cling to that which is good. Romans 12 and verse 9. Abhorring that which is evil means that as righteous people, we're going to try and think the way that God thinks. We're going to try and draw conclusions that are pleasing to God about our lives and about our will and about His will even more so. The Bible would characterize that as wisdom. Looking down to the end of a path and saying, where is this ultimately going to lead me? Where is this ultimately going to find me whenever this is all over? And as we look with the eyes of wisdom and look with the eyes of faith, we see that God has already drawn the conclusions. And if I try and subvert that by saying, well, it doesn't really matter, or this is not really that big a deal, it could be a matter where we're like Lot, trying to vex our righteous soul and change, and we're changing our environment. And we're allowing our soul to be affected by that wickedness, to the point when it comes that we're supposed to let something go. We let it continue our life because, I've always let it go that way. Or I've always done this, or I've always thought this way, and what's that big a deal? It's not that big a deal. Well, to God it is. God hates sin. And the more we can learn to hate sin, and the more we can learn to flee from sin and flee from that which displeases God, the more we're going to be equipped to live righteous lives as pilgrims, as sojourners, more like Abraham in Genesis 18 and less like Lot in Genesis 19. These are great chapters. Great not because of the subject and content that they deal with and the destruction of the unrighteous, the godless, but great in the fact that it reveals that we have a great God that longs to be merciful, that longs to be gracious. And we have a great God that we serve, because the same God of Abraham can be our God today. Thank you for your attention this morning. I hope this has been helpful to you.